Basically, I've been working clinically for quite some years. I'm not working clinically any longer. Went into research. But what we found out, or what we saw when we were working clinically, that in at least a large subpopulation of children who stuttered when you were working clinically with them, what you sometimes saw was that something changed in their environment. Something they didn't like. Some kids had some difficulties dealing with certain situations, dealing with suppressing certain response tendencies, etc. And that was actually the first step towards our idea of doing some research in the area of temperament, in the area of inhibition, in the area of attentional aspects in stuttering. So the talk I will be giving here today is based on the research that we've been doing over the last, let's say, 7 to 9 years, both in Antwerp, Thomas More University in Antwerp, as well as the Catholic University in Leuven and at the University of Toronto in Canada. There is some relation with the talk that Katerina Tulu will do after me, because she has been working in the States and she has been doing some similar kind of research, or at least related to a research center that we were also involved in. When we were talking about inhibition and attention, I think it's good briefly to highlight what do we actually mean by inhibition, what do we actually mean by attention. Well, I'll give you first a kind of general framework that we have been using. It's not our framework, it's a framework by Rothbard, an American researcher, that has done quite extensive research in the area of temperament and in the area of attentional processes. So basically what she's been saying, or what she is saying, is if you are confronted, child, or we ourselves, if we're confronted with a new situation, so a specific stimulus, you can react in two kinds of ways. You can say, hey, I like this kind of situation, and then you have a kind of positive reactivity on one hand, or you can say, I'm not really keen on this, I don't really like this new situation. You will react to a negative way. And the same kind of environment, or the same kind of stimulus, can lead to positive reactivity in one child, and can lead to negative reactivity in another child. You have some kids who like, for instance, lots of noise around them, whereas other kids like the silence around them. So the same kind of stimulus can lead to positive versus negative reactivity depending on child-specific components, depending on environmental components. And how can we detect, how can we see that you see that kind of positive reactivity, saying, oh, this is great, or negative reactivity, I don't like it. You can measure it through different kinds of ways. You can basically, and that's what we've been doing, look at somatic responses, autonomic responses, like heart rate variability. Your heart is going to pound faster. If you don't like something, you're going to have stress hormones released, neuroendocrine aspects like cortisol levels, etc. Or you can also have like more somatic responses, like if you really don't like something, you can turn red, if you're ashamed of certain things, etc. So stimulus can lead to positive and or negative reactivity. When kids become older, they can regulate their own reactivity. And they can say, well, if I'm confronted with a positive environment, if I'm confronted with a positive situation, I like that and I want more of that specific situation. So what children are doing if they're confronted with positive reactivity, and it's here on the right, well, they might say, I'm going to approach that specific situation. I'm going to, so in order to have more of those positive reactivity, whereas if I don't like that situation, I'm going to put my attention somewhere else. Just one example, somebody's ringing on the doorbell, and mom is opening the door, the little child is following mom, and you have two kinds of kids. You have some kids who say, I want to see who it is, I want to see who it is. Well, he's going to be the one who is wanting to open the door, whereas another child who's a bit more afraid is not going to open the door, is going to go behind mom's skirts to hide himself. So two kind of ways of reacting. So wanting to open the door, that's basically approaching, there on the right. Wanting to, I don't want people to see me, is withdrawal, avoidance, inhibition of approach. So it's a kind of framework, kind of temperamental framework, place, inhibition, and attention. Our initial start of our research line was that we did quite a lot of evaluation of what was available in literature and what research was already done. And we basically saw that with regards to reactivity, both positive and or negative reactivity, that in children who stuttered, that there was quite a lot of evidence there that kids who stuttered were higher compared to non-stuttering kids in that reactivity, be it positive or negative reactivity. So that was the first bit. So we assumed that if we were going to use a questionnaire, a parental questionnaire, give it to parents, fill it out, a questionnaire that was measuring reactivity and self-regulation, so I just showed you on the scheme, our hypothesis was that kids who stuttered would be higher in that reactivity. Second hypothesis we had was that kids were going to be lower, children who stuttered as a group would score lower on that self-regulatory component. And what did we do as a next step, and that's basically our research line that we have been focusing on the most, is looking into that self-regulatory component. So we focused on one hand, inhibitory control, so inhibition, and on the other hand, attentional processes. And very briefly, when I'm talking about inhibitory control or inhibition, imagine that you're a little child, 6, 7-year-old, and you go with mom into a candy store, and you're seeing on the counter all these big pots with this really nice candy. And mom goes away, and the woman that's standing in the store also goes away, and you're standing there all by yourself, 7-year-old, seeing all those big candy pots, all the nice candy. Inhibitory control is basically the tendency that you have. Can you inhibit your first response tendencies, saying, well, nobody's seeing it, I'm opening a pot, a piece of candy and eating it. Can you suppress that kind of response tendency? That's one way of explaining inhibitory control. So basically suppressing your first initial response tendencies. So, okay, what kind of studies did we do to measure those different hypotheses? Study one. So we used the temperament questionnaire. It's a validated questionnaire, children's behavior questionnaire, CBQ. And we had a large group of kids who stuttered and kids who did not stutter. I've just listed the criteria here. I'll do that for all the studies, but I'm not going to go in depth into all of those criteria. Basically, all the kids that were in our studies were monolingual Dutch-speaking children. They didn't have any other speech and language and hearing disorders. They didn't have any neurological, any psychological problems. And we made sure that they were stuttering. So the stuttering group had to score above 3% of within word fluencies and also word repetitions, and have to score at least mild on the stuttering severity instrument. So that's our group. So basically, what did we do? We had a temperament questionnaire, quite a long questionnaire. So it was in total a 233-item questionnaire, which takes about 2 hours to fill in. So it's, at this point, not something you can use clinically, unfortunately. But we have been doing studies this year with the shorter version. So there are 2 shorter versions of the CBQ. There's a short version and there's a very short version. And we're analyzing the data basically in the next couple of months to see what can we do clinically with this kind of questionnaire. So you had a total of 233 questions. And some of these questions basically have a bunch of questions that are measuring, for instance, you see inhibitory control there on the right. So there's a group of questions saying, when my child has to be quiet in a situation where he wants to talk a lot, he's able to do so. Yes or no, and somewhere in between. For instance, with regards to questions to anger, frustration, there, the second one on the left. When something doesn't go right, my child gets frustrated very easily. Yes, no. So you have a whole bunch of questions for specific situations. What you see, this is so you have 50 different scales in that questionnaire. They cluster together. For instance, these scales, activity, approach, high intensity pleasure, they all cluster together. What I mean cluster together is if kids score higher on the activity level, they're also bound to score higher on questions with regards to approach, with questions with regards to impulsivity, and they would score lower, for instance, with questions with regards to shyness. So there's a relation between the different scales, and that group of scales can fall on how extrovert are certain kids. You have a second bunch of scales that fall under kind of negative affectivity score. Extroversion is just another term for positive reactivity, the one that you saw in that previous scheme. If confronted with a stimulus, you can react positive or you can react negative. Well, negative affect is just another term for negative reactivity. And you have the final group of scales that are measuring self-regulation or ethical control, the same kind of term. Well, so we gave that questionnaire to parents, we analyzed it, and what did we find out on the questionnaire? Quite interesting data. So on the left there, you see 3 different groups. So this one is positive reactivity, this is negative reactivity, and this is effortful control. Well, what you saw was that the black ones are the kids that stuttered. And with regards to negative reactivity, kids who stuttered scored higher with regards to effortful control. So there are self-regulatory components. Kids who stuttered scored actually lower. Now, a very important thing to take into account is these are group tendencies. In other words, this is if you have a large group of kids who stuttered that you compare with a large group of kids that do not stutter. That does not mean, however, that every child that stutters has difficulties with negative reactivity or positive reactivity. If you have a large group, so it's group tendencies, it's averages. So you might have a child that stutters that does not score higher on positive or negative reactivity compared to a non-stuttering child. If you have large groups, you see those differences. And again, another important thing is when we say you see higher scores on positive and or negative reactivity or effortful control, it's not all these scores fell between the normal variation. There is a difference between significant differences between 2 groups and saying there's an abnormal high or an abnormal low score. If you, for instance, have a child with a very, very low score on effortful control, for instance, a group of children with ADHD or ADD, so with attentional deficit disorders, well, they would score much lower compared to the stuttering group here. So you have to make that distinction. All of these scores fall within the normal variability range. These are the big scales, the 3 overarching scales, negative, positive, reactivity, and self-regulation. If you go into the subscales, and I hope you can read it, but you just have to read the ones there on the right. You see 2 different differences, or 2 significant differences. Well, all of these ones were significant differences that we showed you, but the 2 ones over to the right are the ones we were really interested in. We saw that kids who stuttered, the black lines again, scored lower on inhibitory control. Think of the one you go to the candy store and you have to suppress your response tendencies. They have more difficulties with that. And the one, the scale on attentional shifting. And attentional shifting is basically a scale measuring you're doing a certain task. For instance, kids are sitting at a table and playing a kind of game. And all of the sudden mom says, stop that game and we have to drive to grandma. So in what kind of way can a child shift his attention from, hey, I'm doing this fun game, I have to stop this game, and I can shift my attention to something new that mom says. So we saw that kids who started had more difficulties with that, with those kind of tasks. And that was the reason for us saying, well, we want some more in-depth view of both inhibitory control and attentional shifting. So we went on to a second study where we evaluated attentional networks. And there's a lot of data coming out on attention and a lot of theoretical frameworks on attention. Basically, we used the attention network test, which is again a validated test, which is a combination of two things. It's a combination of a Posner task. And what is a Posner task? It's basically a reaction time task. You sit behind a computer and you're looking at, I'll just show you the task. We're sitting behind a computer and you look at a kind of fixation cross in the middle here. And then we give, kids have to press a response box and they have to press that response box as soon as possible. So you measure children's reaction styles. So they see a fixation cross and something's going to happen, and when something happens, they have to press. That is the classical Posner task. It's a combination of a Posner and a Flannery task. So I'll explain the task here. So this is what kids see at a computer screen. So they don't see all at once, they just see this bit here. What that happens is, sometimes you tell the story that kids are going to see different fish that swim across the screen. And their task is they have to feed the middle fish. And if the fish is looking left, they have to push the left response box. If the fish is looking right, they have to push the right response box. So, very straightforward task. Sometimes, then we get a cue, and a cue is saying, hey, watch, look at it, because now the fish is going to come. So sometimes they do get a cue, which is centrally placed. Sometimes they don't get a cue. So if they don't have a cue, that means that the fish are going to appear without an initial signal saying, pay attention because something's going to happen here. So you have different cueing conditions, and then you have different kinds of targets. Targets, a neutral target, basically just one fish looking at left or right. Simple press left or right. Or you can have more complex situations. So you can have a complex situation where you have like 5 fish in a row and they're looking all at one direction. And the child has to watch the middle fish say, I have to feed that one and press left. Or you have a more complex situation where you have like different fish looking at different directions. And then it becomes more difficult because you have all of these flankers saying, hey, you have to push here to the right, but the child has to focus on the middle fish and push to the left. So it makes it much more complex for a child. Basically, this kind of task measures the 3 main attentional networks. Everyone has 3 attentional networks. What are those 3 attentional networks? It's first of all, it's alerting, it's orienting, and it's conflict. Basically, alerting is when you have a kind of alert state, so that you're aware of the fact that if something changes in your environment, you have noticed it. So it's kind of vigilant state. That's the first attentional network. And there are different brain mechanisms related to that network. Let's not go into different anatomical brain networks, but it's well defined what brain networks and regions are responsible for that. So it's the alerting network. You have the orienting network, and the orienting network is basically a network that allows you to shift your attention from one place to another. Or, for instance, to focus on one point and to delete everything else. For instance, I can focus on my computer screen here and just forget that there are quite a few people sitting in front of me. That is done by my orienting network. And then I have a conflict network. It's a final network. And the conflict network is responsible for if you have to deal with difficult situations where you have to make decisions. Am I going to do A or B? It's done by the conflict network. For instance, if we are looking at these kind of tasks where you have these incongruent flankers, is the conflict network that is actually the most active there. If you look at, for instance, when you get a spatial cue is saying, hey, look here above because the fish is going to appear here on top, or here below because the fish is going to appear here below. That's the orienting network that is activated there. And if you have central cue saying something's going to happen versus no cue, that's the kind of alerting network that's going to be activated. What did we see? Well, the black ones are the kids who stuttered again, whites are the non-stuttering kids. We saw significant differences first of all, in the orienting network. So kids who stuttered had more difficulties in focusing their attention on specific things or refocusing their attention. So shifting their attention towards a certain component or reshifting their attention. There on the right, with regards to conflict, you also see that that was almost significant, but not, so it was almost, but actually not significant, that kids who stuttered scored higher on conflict. So in conflicting situations, kids who stuttered had more difficulties also. So we saw differences on significant differences on one attentional network and almost significant differences in the second attentional network. So we said the first one was with regards to orienting. Let's have a specific task that is measuring both attentional orienting and the conflict score. So what we did was study number 3. We didn't do that study in Belgium. We did that study because in Belgium, of course, you don't have, as you see here, Finnish-speaking kids. So we did that study with a research group in Finland, University of Turku. And what we did over there was we gave kids quite an interesting task. So kids were sitting behind a computer screen with headphones on. We made sure that all kids had normal headsets on. And it was an auditory shifting task. It's a simple task. Well, no, it's not a simple task. So the task consisted of 3 parts. Part 1 was, that's here, see over here. Have their headphones on. If they heard a low tone beep. If they heard 1 tone, they had to press once on the response box. If they heard 2 tones, beep beep, they had to press twice on the response box. So that was your compatible stimulus response coupling, the low tone. The second part of the task was a bit more complex. It was with a high tone. So when they heard it, they had to do the exact opposite. When they heard 1 beat, they didn't have to press once, but they had to press twice, as you see over here. When they heard, they had to press once. So they had to turn, they had to shift their mindset from the first bit. So that was part 2. And then part 3, that was the most complex part, is where you had a mix of low and high tones. So kids were listening through these earphones and heard beep, press once, beep, beep, press twice, press twice, beep, press once. So it was a combination of high and low tones. So it was quite a complex task, which basically measures 2 things. It measures both the conflict network and the orienting network. And hey, what did we find out here with regards to the line on top here are the stuttering kids, the line here are the non-stuttering kids. You see already that at block 2, when kids have to shift their mindset, it's already a bit more difficult. These are significant differences. It's a bit more difficult for the stuttering kids, but with regards to block 3, where you have these very low, very high tones, and where you have to constantly shift their mindset, it is much more difficult for the stuttering kids versus the non-stuttering kids. So it becomes much more difficult. And you see also that the stuttering kids, it's always the left ones over here, begin to have more premature responses being, they have difficulties waiting, and they just start pressing the response boxes without having a stimulus first. So basically, when children who stuttered, if I translate it to some normal situations, if children who stuttered as a group are confronted with more conflicting situations, stuttering kids have more difficulties in processing information that comes from that situation. What does that mean therapeutically? What can you do as a therapist with that kind of information? Fourth study we did was a study on inhibitory control. And that's the study, basically it's a computer study, but it's basically measuring the same kind of thing as we were talking about the candy store. So what we said was, put kids behind a computer screen, basically straightforward, simple task. We saw a black computer screen again, with a white fixation cross. And we said, well, you're going to see a little man that pops up. When it's a green man that is walking, you receive what go stimulus. So what you have to do is press the response box as quickly as you can. So green man is press as quickly as you can. So you train kids. So I'm simplifying these tasks a bit here, but before kids could do this task, they were explained quite in detail what they had to do. They were first, before they sat behind the computer screen, they were showing pictures of this green man. It was checked, did they understand everything? So it took quite a while before you could administer this task. So green man push, green man push, green man push, and when you see a red man appearing, you mustn't push, you have to stop pushing. So green push, green push, green push. So kids are, and you say you have to do it very quick, as soon as possible. So you're like, quick, 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 and then you see a red man and say, oh, I had to stop, but I didn't. So that's the inhibitory control. Can you suppress that response tendency? You see a kind of similarity that, hey, I'm in this store, I want this candy, mom is not here, the seller is not here, I have to suppress my. So it's the same kind of task, but a bit more in experimental design. I would love to do the other task also with the candy store. What did we find out? Basically, our hypothesis was confirmed that black ones are the kids who stutter again. And the stuttering kids had more difficulties with inhibiting their response tendencies than the non-stuttering kids. So they had what's called here false alarms. False alarm is basically you see a red man saying you mustn't push, but they did push. So they had much more reactions or false alarms to the red mans, and you also saw more premature responses. Again, premature responses, hey, this task is a bit difficult and I'm just going to push, 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 push. So the task was more difficult for stuttering kids. Stuttering kids had more difficulties in inhibiting their responses. Then we had a final task that we did, and I'm going to stop with all of my computer paradigms. We were looking into the fact that with this first inhibitory control task, it was the child himself had to say, I'm going to push or I'm not going to push. We thought, can we make the task a bit more complex, or can we help the child a bit more? Can we give a kind of external signal saying, hey, you have to push or you have to suppress, versus a task where the child has to do it all by himself. So in other words, if we give external cues, auditive signals saying, do this or do that, does it make it easier for a child that stutters yes or no? So we have two kinds of tasks. So what I'm talking about, exogenous and endogenous, is basically pointing towards the fact if you help the child with signals, saying now you have to do this or you don't have to do it, exogenous cue. Endogenous, the child has to do it all by himself. So we have two kinds of tasks. The one was called, you might not be able to read it all, it's the one on top, it's called stop signal task. So you're doing something and you have to, you're doing something and you have to stop what you're doing, stop signal task. And the second one is sustained attention task. It's basically a kind of boring task where you have to keep your attention focused for a very long time. And the idea we had was, if we're going to give these two different tasks, might there be a difference in two tasks in kids who stutter? Question mark. So, this one is the paradigm again for the stop signal task. Briefly explain. So kids are sitting behind a computer screen, so these are the Go trials. Kids are sitting behind a computer screen, and what they see is a computer screen with a cross on it. And what you explain to kids is, if a circle appears, they have to push the right response box. If a square appears, they have to push the left response box. So you train kids. So you have a computer, circle, right, circle, right, circle, right, square, left, circle, right. So that's the kind of task they have to do. That's step one. And you make the task a bit more complex, and you say, if you hear through your earphones a beep, that means you shouldn't press the response button. So that's the second kind of task. It's the stop signal trials. So same kind of task. They are confronted with that cross. They see a circle and they want to press the right response box. But after that circle already appeared, and after their finger is already perhaps in motion, or their motor response is already initiated, they hear beep, and then I have to suppress that response tendency. So kind of similar kind of task as the green-red man task, but a bit more complex. Why? Because here the motor response has already started. It might be that the finger is literally already moving, or it might be that the finger is not moving, but that the mind has already said, hey, you have to press that response box. So this was the task that measured exogenous response control, because there was an external signal saying, go, no, that's stop or go. Here what we saw was, and that was, we were quite surprised actually by this. Again, the black bars are the stuttering kids. What we saw over here was that kids who stuttered didn't score worse than the non-stuttering kids, but they scored actually better than the non-stuttering kids. So they reacted faster, all their reaction times were faster than the non-stuttering kids. If you look, so that's here above, so all the reaction times on the different kinds, both on the GO trials as, so they were all faster. If you look at the amount of missed trials, so here also, they had better scores with regards to the stop signal trials. Kids who stuttered were better able, could perform better in inhibiting their response to something totally different compared to the results of the previous task. The go, no go, the red hat, green hat task. What's the difference between those two tasks? Well, here, with regards to the stop signal task, we have an external signal saying, beep, stop. With regard to the red green hat task, you didn't have that external signal saying, stop. Kids had to do it themselves. Which is basically quite an interesting finding. We had a second kind of study, which is sustained attention task. It takes quite a long while, and kids have to press when they see certain animals appearing in one of the windows. It's basically a task that measures response inhibition, but not with an external signal. Kids have to maintain their attention and have to be as precise over a long period of time. And what you see there again is that although kids who stuttered scored faster, reacted faster, they had much more faults, made much more errors during this specific task. So, if you compare the green man, red man task, stop signal task, kids who stuttered have more difficulties with that. If you look at the stop signal task with regards to the square and the circle and the beeps, kids were better at that task. Here, if you look at this kind of task, where they had to control it themselves again they were worse at this kind of task. So you see that there is some kind of aspect that if kids get, if kids get external input saying you have to stop, then it's easier for them. But if they have to do it themselves, it becomes much more difficult for them compared to the non-stuttering case. So, in conclusion, what does this actually all mean? So, we saw that children who stuttered scored actually, and that's data from the from the temperament questionnaire. We saw that children who stuttered, that they scored higher on the negative reactivity and lower on effortful control. So that's the parental temperament questionnaire that you have, that we're currently trying to validate a shorter version so we can use it clinically. So that was something we initially anticipated, and basically that was also something that we found in the research. So that's one of the first findings. Then I wanted to find out, well, can that kind of finding, higher on reactivity, lower in effortful control of self-regulation, can we corroborate that? Can we duplicate that by the more, objectifiable measures? Because, we can give some critique to these kind of measures because parents make a judgment of their child, the parental questionnaire. And one might say, well, it's not really measuring what the child is able to do. It is basically measuring the idea parents have of their child. And there might be a difference between the two of them. So that's the reason why we said we want to use this kind of computer paradigms. Well, but what we found out about computer paradigms was that our findings from that questionnaire were basically being validated, so that kids who stuttered, again, important to take into account, as a group scored lower or were less efficient in attentional processes compared to the non-stuttering kids. The reason why I'm saying as a group is always important, because you might have a child that stutters that is not scoring worse but is scoring better compared to some other child that doesn't stutter. So they were scoring lower on attentional processes, and with regards to inhibition, inhibitory control, they also had more difficulties with that. Basically, what might that all mean? Well, with regards to that higher score on reactivity, lower score on effortful control, there is quite a lot of data out there, not related to stuttering, but related to psychological disorders or anxiety disorders, that if you have a child that has a high score on negative reactivity and a low score on self-regulation, that kind of temperamental constellation might be a kind of seed to develop certain specific developmental disorders. There's also some very interesting research that the higher your self-regulation is that a child has, so the better a child can focus attention, the better a child can inhibit one's responses. That is a kind of protective agency towards high scores or low scores on reactivity. So it's not so much high reactivity and low effortful control, but it's the interaction between the two of them. So what we assume is that temperament, or these reactivity and effortful control components, actually play a role, perhaps not so much in the onset, but definitely in the development of stuttering. So when a child begins to stutter, what you see over time, if a child stutters for a longer time, that stuttering patterns change, that the child reacts to his own stuttering, that stuttering quite often becomes worse. Well, what we assume and what we hypothesize is that these kind of findings, this kind of temperament, constellation, inhibitory control, reactivity, play a role in the worsening of stuttering. In other words, what we assume is that if you have a child that starts stuttering and that has high scores on reactivity and low scores on self-regulation, that child might actually be prone to more chronic stuttering compared to a child that would have high scores on self-regulation and lower scores on effortful control. And again, that is what we are currently trying to find out in a longitudinal study. So that's the first bit. We also think these findings play a real role in stress-related situations. Well, if you have a child that is confronted, think back of the original slide, stimulus, positive, negative, reactive. If you have a child that is confronted with new stimulus, we know, not from our own research, but from other research, that if a child that stutters is confronted with stressful stimulations, then the stuttering is bound to increase. For instance, in Belgium we have December is a busy month. 5th of December we have Sinterklaas, somebody will bring presents to the kids. So they're having quite a lot of anxiety for that occasion. 25th of December, Christmas tree, presents again. So December is a month where they have quite a lot of arousal, where you tend to see more stuttering kids compared to other months where you have less arousal. So what we assume is that these kind of self-regulatory components play a role in dealing with these stress-related situations. We also think it plays a role in conditioning processes. Some kids, when they stutter, might react stronger to their own moments of stuttering compared to non-stuttering or to other kids. So if you have a child that is high in negative reactivity, and that child stutters, and is, for instance, confronted with his own stutter, it might be that those kids with high reactivity, low self-regulation, will react stronger to it and will say, I don't like this, and will get more easily conditioned, negatively conditioned to their own stuttering. Or might get also more negatively conditioned by the fact that mom says, hey, you didn't say that right, start over, or breathe in. It might be that those kids with high reactivity, low effortful control might react stronger and get easily conditioned to listener reactions. Second bit, with regards to attentional processes, we know again from research, not from our own research, but from psychological research, that attentional orienting plays a key role in dealing with stressful situations. In other words, if I am confronted with a stressful situation, I have one important self-regulatory process that I can use. I can shift my attention away and go somewhere else. Or if I would be stressed out now, I could shift my internal attention and say, I'm going to think, I'm sitting on an island, it's very quiet, I'm not looking at all the eyes looking at me, I'm not looking at that, I'm just thinking of something else. I can shift my internal attention. So attentional shifting plays a key role in how you deal with emotional reactivity. We know that emotions and stressful situations play a key role in triggering more stuttering in kids. So it might be linked to this whole idea of lower efficiency in certain attentional processes. Another interesting finding is, I said initially, attentional orienting, alerting, conflict, all of these three networks have different anatomical regions in the brain. If you look at the anatomical region for visual orienting, it is the same anatomical region for temporal orienting. And what is temporal orienting? I'm just giving you one example. If you're standing in front of a traffic light, what you sometimes see, we don't have it in Belgium, but well, it's red, orange, and green. And in Belgium, if it's red, you have to wait. Well, I assume you have to do that in every country. And then it turns green, and then you can drive. In some countries, you don't turn from red to green directly, but it turns from red to orange and then to green. And what temporal orienting actually does is, when it's red and it then turns orange, it gives you actually a cue saying, hey, prepare yourself because you can go. And then it turns green and you go. So that is temporal orienting. And what you see is that temporal orienting is a very important executive function if we want to plan our own speech. Because speech motor planning is basically the most complex motor planning that people can do. And temporal orienting is a very important process in that. So it might well be that the visual orienting task we use, so we saw differences in visual orienting, it overlaps with temporal orienting, and we know that temporal orienting is important in speech planning, speech motor planning. So it might be also linked to that kind of finding. Then finally, I'm going to skip the others. Finally, with regards to inhibition, what we saw was that if inhibitory control, the kids who started scoring lower on inhibitory control, but if the inhibitory control was externally triggered, remember that beep saying stop, you should stop that. If it was externally triggered, kids were better. When they had to do it themselves, kids were worse. Again, if you look at the brain function, you have a network which is called the frontal-basal ganglia circuit. Quite a complex thing, I'm not going to go in depth with that. But basically, that frontal-basal ganglia circuit, basal ganglia are responsible for speech motor planning. If we're moving somewhere, something, it's the basal ganglia that are saying, do it now, do it now. And the basal ganglia are connected through different, or by different brain regions, through cortex, etc. There are two different kinds of pathways if it's external trigger or internal trigger. So it's kind of pathway A if you have an external signal, pathway B if you have to do it all by yourself, internal signal. So what we see is, based on our research, what we assume is that pathway A, where it's externally triggered, no problems with kids who start. Pathway B, we assume that there might be problems with kids who started over there. If we compare that finding with the ample research that is there from brain imaging research, we haven't done any brain imaging research. But there is brain imaging research in the area of stuttering, not so much in kids, primarily in adults. But the very interesting finding they had was, if they looked at that frontal basal ganglia circuit, well, they didn't find any significant differences in pathway A, but they did find significant differences in pathway B. So our research seems to overlap a bit with that kind of brain imaging research. Please take into account that I'm oversimplifying certain things, pathway A and pathway B. It's a bit more complex, but I'm just didactic purposes. So we do see some differences with regards to inhibition, with regards to attentional processes, and actually it's linked to what we earlier saw on the temperamental questionnaire and whatnot, but it's also linked to what we see in other research actually. So basically, the first blue line there is stating vulnerability versus disability hypothesis. The question is, our findings that we have, do they point towards, is this one of the causes of stuttering, or is this the result of kids that have stuttered for X amount of years and that score different on these specific executive function tasks? Well, we think it's highly unlikely that it's a disability hypothesis or that our findings are linked or due to the fact that kids have been stuttering for a couple of years and now they score lower on these tasks. Because these tasks really measure a very basic response tendency. They measure very basic executive functions that are not bad to change over 1 or 2 years. So our research is not linked to it's a result of the study. No, it has to do something with cause or onset or development of stuttering. With regards to what we're currently doing, is we're not so much using these kind of computer tasks, but we're currently doing longitudinal studies or starting longitudinal studies to find out, well, if you have certain constellations in these kids, find kids that score very low on reactive or very high in reactivity and low on self-regulation. Might it be those kids that become chronic stutterers versus kids with high self-regulatory components? Might those kids have more chance on spontaneous recovery? As we all know, there's a high chance of spontaneous recovery in study. So that's the kind of meta-method and prospective longitudinal research we're currently doing. The question you always tend to get is, well, interesting, this research, what can we do with it? What are the therapeutical implications? Well, I would like to say 2 things. If you have a child that is lower in inhibitory control, you have to be aware of the fact that it does play an impact on emotional regulation. It does play an impact on how quickly a child gets frustrated. So it gives you some kind of basis, some kind of rationale for, on one hand, working on frustration tolerance in very young kids who stutter, because if you work on frustration tolerance, which is a basic problem-solving strategy that you learn in kids, they're much easier or much more able to deal with certain stressful situations. With regards to lower scores on attentional orienting, with regards to lower scores on attentional shifting, well, be aware of the fact that if you confront some stuttering kids with new situations, if you take them out of situation A to situation B, also clinically, if you work first on topic A and you move to topic B, it's sometimes difficult for them. So you have to plan it in advance. You have to give them some kind of signals in advance to decrease, for instance, stress levels. What we sometimes do is, I gave the example earlier of December, busy month, so something's going to happen, a lot of arousal. So you can do 2 things. In some kids, it's better not to say anything about that because it's going to increase the emotional regulation. If you're only 1st of November going to say, well, 30 nights, 30 times sleeping, and then you get big presents from Santa Claus or Christmas, Father Christmas, it's going to increase arousal. But in some other kids, it's better to warn them in advance because then they can deal with these kind of situations in somewhat easier way. So basically, that was the talk I wanted to give you. It's the result of the research we've been doing over the last, well, 5 to 7 years, and we're still doing it. I know it's kind of experimental work with not many direct implications for research, but I hope you find it interesting. If you have questions,